Greetings, comrades. Events in the Middle East have taken a dramatic turn in recent days, one that could seriously alter the course of the revolutionary movement in that region. The main flashpoints are Egypt and Syria. A recent surge in aggression against those regimes has made the struggle much more acute. However, foreign manipulation, both on the ground and in the media, threatens to derail the democratic revolution and cause greater instability in the region. Since the fall of US-backed President Hosni Mubarak, caused by the mass mobilization of the Egyptian working class, as well as a loss of support from the military and imperialist powers for the president, Egypt has been under the authority of a military junta. And while the head of the regime has been cut off, we should be in no doubt that the body, the bourgeoisie and the military structure, is very much alive, is taking real steps to assert itself over the population, and has proven itself even more brutal than under Mubarak. Journalists, trade unionists and other activists continue to be arrested, tortured and killed in ever greater numbers. Sectarian violence has been encouraged by the state. Democratic elections have continued to be postponed, living and working conditions fail to improve, the success of the revolution is seeming increasingly hollow in the eyes of the Egyptian workers. Faced with the increasingly real prospect of full-blown counter-revolution, the working class has seen fit to intervene once again on the political stage by occupying Tahrir Square and other places in Egypt. Protests and demonstrations have continued and are often put down violently. The trade union movement has led a campaign of strikes against the regime, demanding reasonable wages and better working conditions, aided politically by the coalition of socialist forces, a popular front of Trotskyist, Leninist and social democratic groups, representing not only the highest level of organisation of revolutionary workers in Egypt so far, perhaps even more importantly, left unity. The coalition represents the first concrete steps towards a democratic party of all workers, and it is vital that this unity be encouraged and nurtured, that discipline and loyalty towards the organisation be forged, and that it be run according to the principle of democratic centralism, diversity in thought and unity in action, an example comrades in the West should definitely set about following. This coalition, however, is dwarfed by the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood, the largest opposition group, some of whose membership is responsible for part of the massive demonstrations we've seen over the last few days. While the Brotherhood holds sway over large sections of the population, especially amongst the very poorest, many observers, both inside and outside of Egypt, are apprehensive about the prospect of an Islamist-led government. The West's main fear is that a breaking of ties between Egypt and Israel. Mubarak's regime inherited and maintained an alliance from the days of Anwar Sadat, much to the annoyance of other Arab nationalist-led countries, for example Libya and Syria. As a result, the West felt Egypt to be a suitably reliable enough country to become a key military ally in the region, granting it military aid in quantities second only to Israel itself. The loss of such an ally and the possibility of all that aid falling into the wrong hands is too great therefore to be left to fate, or worse, a radicalised population with anti-Western sentiments. It comes as no surprise then that the West has continued to fund, arm and politically strengthen Egypt's ruling military junta and is aiding and abetting the Egyptian counter-revolution. Egypt is quietly terrified of losing its giant Arab neighbour as an ally, home to over 80 million people, and not to mention one of the largest Western armed militaries in the world, especially at a time when the prospect of war with Iran, secession of Palestine, and Syria and Jordan exploding into conflict seem very likely. More on that last point later. Within Egypt, secular nationalist, liberal and leftist factions and their supporters are suspicious of the Muslim Brotherhood. At the very least, they fear an encroachment of Egypt's secularism, or in the case of certain nationalist tendencies, the military being edged out by the clergy as the leading institution in society. At the very worst, they fear a repeat of the Iranian Revolution and the radical Islamist government of Khomeini. This, however, seems unlikely. The Western-aligned powers, it can be assumed, are actively propagating fear about the Muslim Brotherhood, seemingly to promote the military junta, the old regime and the status quo as a safe alternative to a potentially radicalised Egypt. This strategy rightly seems hollow, considering that the West has backed Islamist governments, albeit not fundamentalist ones, in Iraq, Afghanistan and Libya, and in the case of the first two, much blood has been shed in order to keep them there. It's not too late for that to happen in Libya as well. Upcoming parliamentary elections, however, will not be a major gain for Egypt. The junta will remain as head of state for at least 2 years, which could easily be extended, and will retain veto power over the parliament, rendering it essentially a rubber stamp assembly. What is feared by some is that the Muslim Brotherhood may sell its soul, so to speak, granting the military junta state power and keeping for itself authority over the cultural, social and educational aspects of Egyptian life. While in agreement with the Brotherhood's anti-imperialist stance, Marxists should not in any way view it as a strategic ally. Its views on social justice are backwards, and it does not seek to advance the cause of the working class. Islamism is completely incompatible with the Marxist program of emancipation of the working class, culturally, socially, and economically. The Brotherhood-sponsored Freedom and Justice Party's policies are pro-neoliberal and on the whole negative for the stature of workers in Egyptian society. In short, they are pro-business and will probably not make efforts to improve the conditions that Egyptian workers are struggling against. Because Egypt was a long-time Soviet ally and an enemy of Israel, some comrades have brought up the possibility of past and perhaps present collusion with Western intelligence services and the Brotherhood. However, I've not really done enough research on this subject to make any certain claims about it. Still, it's not entirely out of the question. The West will back any group in Egypt it thinks that may continue the current state of relations, at least on the ground if not in words. If it can, it will try and tempt the Muslim Brotherhood onto its side as well, and this is something we must look out for over the next few months or years. Despite the Egyptian cabinet stepping down as a result of the crackdown, the Brotherhood's leadership has recently called for an end to protests against the military junta, and in terms of securing political concessions for the organisation, it's well within its interest to halt the revolution, much like the compromisers the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries did after the February Revolution in 1917. A rift between the rank and file and the leadership is already beginning to form. In any case, the point is that Western imperialism will take any practical steps it can to ensure that Egypt remains a safe and reliable ally in the region and is intent on cultivating new allies. Western-backed dictators may be being toppled, but that does not mean that the imperialists will not be able to come out of this situation positively. While Egypt appears to be a simple case of a struggle by the people against dictatorship and imperialism, concerns and risks about the Muslim Brotherhood aside, Syria presents a much more complicated and dangerous situation for the region as a whole. In Syria, a civil war is going on. On the one side, anti-Western Assad regime, and on the other, various opposition groups. The opposition is centred around two separate organisations, the Syrian National Council, which models itself on the Libyan National Transitional Council, and the National Coordination Committee for Democratic Change. The former, through its armed wing, the Free Syrian Army, now seeks to overthrow the government of Assad via armed struggle, whilst the latter is pressing for democratic reform and a maintenance of the state structure in general. Unlike Libya, however, Syria has a great variety of political parties, both in opposition and in the National Progressive Front, the ruling coalition, containing a mix of social democratic, communist, Arab nationalist and pseudo-fascist parties, i.e. the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, all of which submit to the rule of the Ba'ath Party, in a system not dissimilar to that found in China. In Syria, we have initially seen mass protests and acts of civil resistance. There is much dissatisfaction with the Ba'athist-led government, which, since making reforms towards a more free market economy, has suffered from increasing youth unemployment, loss of social welfare for the disadvantaged, and a deterioration in living standards. Such reforms tend to have these effects in third world countries with semi-socialist orientated economies. Other problems include tensions between the ruling Shia Alawite religious sect, which dominates the government, and the majority Sunni sect, and discrimination faced by minority Christian sects. Another problem is the tension between Arabs and Kurds, who make up 8% of the total population. The northeast of Syria, which contains most of Syria's oil reserves, is part of what would be Kurdistan. The large protest movement has faced excessive violent crackdowns from Syria's security services and large counter-demonstrations from Assad supporters. Some small towns, dominated by anti-Assad sentiments, have been placed under siege by the army, causing casualties on both sides. Sunni protesters have accused the Shabiha Alawite paramilitary group of targeting Sunni protesters. Syrian refugees have begun to run away to some of the surrounding countries like Turkey, Jordan and Lebanon. In the case of Lebanon, Syrian military have actually crossed the border into Lebanese territory, violating the country's sovereignty in order to pursue fleeing dissidents as many as 3 times in October. Since then, however, a minefield has been placed there instead. Additionally, Assad's government has faced a growing insurgency from army defectors, organised into the Free Syrian Army, whose leadership is based in Turkey, and whose stated objective is to protect the protest movement from the state. They've also faced armed Islamist groups and tribal-based militias. Tactics have included guerrilla attacks against the security forces and pro-government paramilitaries, and assassinations of government and army officials and pro-government supporters. Syria's porous borders have not only allowed refugees to escape, but have allowed a steady flow of weapons and personnel to non-FSA militias, including the Islamist groups involved in previous uprisings, which have since lain dormant. It is very likely that elements of foreign intelligence have also sneaked in and implanted themselves within opposition groups. Despite the legitimate calls for major reforms within the Syrian government, the opposition movement has taken on an alarmingly sectarian character. One chant heard from the protesters has been Christians to Beirut, Alawites to the coffins. Minority groups in Syria fear a repeat of the Iraqi civil war and the horrifying sectarian violence which took place during it, including the near decimation of the Iraqi Christian population. These legitimate fears have resulted in low participation by these minority groups in the uprisings. Most of the Kurdish parties have boycotted the Syrian opposition conferences held in Turkey due to the country's oppression of Turkish Kurds. While Turkey, along with NATO, has ruled out direct action against the Syrian government, it has, along with Jordan and with the support of France, announced that it is considering the creation of a buffer zone along the borders of Syria, presumably to protect refugees without actually having them on their own soil. Cemil Bayik, leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, better known as the PKK, a left-wing nationalist party with socialist leanings, have been engaged in serious armed struggle against the Turkish oppression of Kurdistan for many years, has stated that should Turkey attack Syria, the PKK would fight on the side of the Syrian government. Roj Welat, another PKK spokesman, has however noted the need for serious reform in Syria. The creation of any kind of buffer zone on Syrian soil should obviously be opposed. Firstly, it's blatantly the Turkish government taking advantage of the chaos in Syria to A. bring the opposition over to the side of imperialism, B. an opportunity for them to strike at Kurdish groups operating on the border regions of Syria, and C. it may be an attempt to cut Syria's oil reserves in the northeast off from the government. The fact that the Syrian government views this area as strategically important means there's a good chance that it may use its military to repel any Turkish incursion, a situation which could quickly spiral out of control. Any Jordanian incursion also carries some serious risks. Syria has been a long-time champion of the Palestinian rights and is viewed favourably by many militant Palestinian groups. Jordan has a population of 2,700,000 Palestinians who might seriously object to Jordanian action against an ally of Palestine. A repeat of the Black September events would also contribute to wider instability and may even draw Israel into the conflict, which in turn could draw in Iran, and then shit will be seriously fucked up. I think that the Turkish and Jordanian involvement in a Syrian civil conflict could potentially draw in the Turkish PKK conflict and perhaps even the wider Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Hezbollah has also come out on the side of Assad. So my fear is that what we might see if foreign powers attempt to meddle in the Syrian situation is a regional war that could spill out everywhere. The opposition may begin to see Kurds as the enemy, siding with Turkey, and the alleged involvement of Iran in quelling the uprising. Sunni and Shia unity will be completely shattered, leading to a repeat of the Iraqi civil war. To put it succinctly, I view foreign involvement as possibly leading towards an enormous sectarian conflict throughout the entire region. Iran, it should be noted, may be playing a double game here, supporting the PKK by proxy through Syria, but also announcing that it will cooperate militarily in fighting Kurdish rebels with Turkey. But all this confusion, in all this confusion and horrible danger, we start to see a pattern emerge. What we see is an attempt to orientate the revolutions in the Arab world towards a pro-Western position. The Syrian National Council has modelled itself on the Libyan National Transitional Council and will look for Western support should it succeed. It clearly views Libya as a success story at a time when the General Secretary of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, has released a report condemning the illegal imprisonment of 7,000 people in Libya, many of whom have been tortured and held in private prisons, over which the NTC has no real control. Not to mention the clashes between rival rebel brigades. Yet we also see material support for crackdowns against protesters in Bahrain, Egypt and Yemen, all of whom have Western-friendly governments. As I stated earlier, the imperialist powers are trying to pull the best result as they can out of the situation in the Middle East. The situation to me points to the need for a broad movement with a secular, internationalist and anti-imperialist worldview. How can it be that in Libya and Syria we see opposition movements leaning towards the same powers that are aiding and abetting suppression of the opposition movements in Egypt, Yemen and Bahrain? The opposition leaders are looking towards short-term gains that they can make only for their own countries and not towards the interests of the Arab Revolution as a whole, and that is why we have this contradiction. This is why the movement is being increasingly divided along sectarian and ethnic lines. What we see is not the Arab world moving along the same path, but splitting along different paths, depending on who the government in question is friendly with. That's why I fear that this whole situation could be heading in an extremely dangerous direction. As Marxists, we oppose foreign interference in the Arab Revolution. We oppose foreign attacks on Syria and will support the Syrian people in any such conflict. We oppose sectarian and ethnic violence, and we call for a broad movement against imperialism, a movement of solidarity and internationalism. Islamists and nationalists have nothing to offer the working class and only have the interests of their sect or their flag at heart. Only a working class conscious of its own historical mission can truly claim victory. Red salutes, comrades.